Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of the Koos Dev Talk. Koos Dev Talk is a weekly podcast where the three of us,
Parsa.
Justin.
and myself, Jeff, discuss about topics covering tech and dev. In today's episode, we will discuss about Babel and open source. I will let Justin explain why, and then Parsa will briefly explain what Babel is. Thank you.
So, why are we talking about Babel.js today? Very recently, they had a blog post titled, Babel is used by millions, and so why are we running out of money? This was posted on May 10th by the Babel core team. They prefaced it by saying, since 2018, Babel's been doing a funding experiment whether or not Babel could be sustained purely as open source software, and their conclusion is that the answer might be no. They were talking about how Henry, one of the developers on the core team, was paid a salary for a year, and that was just over about $120,000 a year. And then they also wanted to, or further later on, expanded to support 3 additional maintainers, Junliang, Kai, and Nicolo. And they were talking about how in 2018, one of the devs, Henry, had left his job to try to work on open source for Babel, work for Babel full time. And so Babel had settled on paying Henry $11,000 per month as baseline salary for working full-time on the open source program. And then they also ended up wanting to pay Junliang, Nicola, and Kai $2,000 per month. And so they were burning through about $17,000 per month in cash, and they only pull in about $150,000 per year, according to their post. And so they estimated that they required double that, $330,000, and so they've reached their conclusion that they wouldn't be able to sustain Babel as open source, or at least that's perhaps that's their conclusion. Whether or not that's actually true is something we'll be discussing today. And so I'll turn it over to Parsa to talk about briefly intro what Babel.js is, just in case you don't know.
There's a good chance that you've been using Babel even though you don't know it. So Babel is a JavaScript compiler, and it actually does quite a lot. So one of the things that I rely so heavily on Babel on is just converting everything to ES5. We all use ES6 in our front-end code. We probably all do, let's say. And we're just assured that everything's going to work out in the browser. But we all know that we have users using IE6. We have users using all kinds of browsers with all kinds of versions, but most of the time it turns out fine. And one of the players that help us get to that result is Babel, because Babel converts everything in the background to ES5. So that's one of their biggest features that they have in Babel. But chances are you've used React, and when we use React, we use JSX. JSX is a Babel feature, or I should say JSX compiling is a Babel feature. So when we use React, we don't use React DOM methods to create elements. We just use a JSX syntax, and that's all possible because Babel in the background compiles everything to pure JavaScript and React code, which is React.createElement and React DOM.render. We don't see these stuff because Babel is in the background doing all these work for us. And the third thing I wanted to mention that Babel does for us that we barely notice is TypeScript. So when we use TypeScript, we have all these extra code that shouldn't be there. And if we put those in JavaScript, it's just going to give us an error because those are TypeScript code that are not valid in JavaScript. But when we use TypeScript, it uses Babel to strip our code from those TypeScript things and give us a pure JavaScript function. And just to mention, big companies use Babel. Instagram uses Babel, Robinhood uses Babel, Discord, Alibaba Travels. All of these companies use, I'm assuming, React, and in consequence, they're using Babel to use JSX syntax inside their React applications. Babel has 22 million downloads every week. So we're talking about a huge project that if Babel faces any issues, some of these companies are going to have to save them because they're just relying on Babel so heavily. So that's kind of a wrap up about what Babel is and why it's important to the dev community. I'll pass it on to Justin again.
Thanks, Barca. So I was kind of looking into this post, and then I was just kind of curious. So then I looked into the contributions to Babel, and Sebastian Mackenzie comes up first. He's actually the author of Babel, and so you can see that he has crazy levels of commits all the way through to 2016. The person they're paying is Henry, and he shows up as HZoo. He has a whole bunch of commits as well, but when we look at his timeline, it's kind of interesting, at least to me, that a lot of his commits are from somewhere between 2015 to early 2019. And then you can see little bits of orange. And for our audio-only audience, I am referring to the GitHub contributors page, which showcases the number of commits that they have to their main branch. Most of Henry's commits are, again, from 2015 to very early 2019. And the other people that are maintaining the code and they say are part of their core team is Nicolo. For Nicolo, we can kind of see that he's constantly making some commits to the main branch from 2019 onward. And then we can also see another member on the core team, JL Huang, and he's committing also about halfway 2019 to current. And I kind of poked through some of their branches, and the most notable contributor that I saw even on the other branches was Nicolo. I didn't really see much of Henry on there, so I just thought that was kind of interesting when the blog post is talking about paying Henry as one of their, I guess, like their main dev person, the 120,000, but he doesn't really show up in the Git history after 2019.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we also have a lot of transparency when we're talking about open source packages like Babel, because we can see everything that's happening with the package. But I wanna point out maybe Henry's been doing some of the grind work where he has to like resolve issues and add documentation. So maybe Henry's been doing those stuff, but that was a really good point to talk about their GitHub and see actually how they've been working on it. And another thing I want to point out, Justin, is because I know GitHub shows these commits in comparison to each other, so they're in the same scale. When I look at Sebastian, that's a lot of commits comparing to how much these people have been doing during the past couple years. So either Sebastian was committing a lot during those years, or these people combined aren't just committing that much, which might mean they're not putting that much time, or it just might mean that they're writing really quality code that takes a long time to write.
Well, I'm assuming that because Sebastian's the original author, he's the one that made most of the code in the beginning, and so a lot of that dev work is done up front, and so there's just more development. Today is, I can't tell in terms of features what they're working on, but it looks like it's mostly maintenance stuff, like changing packages to ensure that they're not using deprecated packages, and then ensuring that Babel works for compiling recent versions of frameworks like React or Vue or whatever the case may be. And so, the amount of work today, which presumably mostly maintenance and work on new features, is just less than in the original. But my point wasn't to suggest that Henry's not working on the open source project. It was just interesting to see how his development pattern has stopped since 2019, or at least it's different. Maybe he's just doing other stuff as the kind of, you could say, CEO doing more business functions and this kind of thing. Jeff, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to slightly disagree based on just looking at the numbers of the amount of code being pushed. Like the number itself, I don't think it tells the full story. The depth of the code itself, you could push a lot of code and only have one commit versus pushing the same amount of code and make 30 commits. It doesn't mean that you wrote less or more code.
I think the important thing to take away from graphs is that we have a baseline, and everyone's baseline will look different depending on your development style in terms of like how much code you like to commit. Some people like to commit like crazy, like maybe I'm kind of guilty of that, but you'd kind of expect that your baseline, your average commit history would kind of continue throughout. Maybe there are changes over time because your coding style has changes, but to kind of have like and again, looking at Henry's like graph, it's kind of fairly level, and then all of a sudden it's kind of gone. But I actually want to talk about whether or not Babel's conclusion is the right conclusion. So they asked the question, can they work full-time on Babel, and is that sustainable? And then they are concluding that the answer is no. And I would like to suggest that that's not necessarily the right conclusion that they should have. And the reason why I say that is because we can look at other open source models and then see how they survive, or actually not even really survive, they flourish. People are saying that open source is consuming software, consuming proprietary software, because open source has just become so dominant in today's development space. Kind of part of that is thinking about what business model Babel could potentially use, and I don't suggest that I'm anything much of a business person, but when we look at business models, there are many open source programs that we can think of: Kubernetes, React, Docker, GitHub, Red Hat. There are a lot of really large businesses out there, Webpack, that do fine sustaining an open source business model. So I think it's more appropriate to talk about or think about why Babel isn't able to do it. And so I think taking a business lens, we can kind of see that Babel doesn't really have a revenue model. They don't really have a business model. Right now their business model is, can we get funding from companies that would be happy to donate to us and then live off the donations? And from that business model, we can kind of conclude that their conclusion is correct, that they can't sustain a donation only model. And when we look at their donations, we can kind of see that they have quite a bit of large sums, one-time sums. It's kind of important to note one-time sums. So we can see Handshake, they gave them 100,000. Facebook Open Source gave them 34,000, and then a few other ones that are large one-time donations. I think when we're talking about a business, and Webpack actually does this, is they should actually be seeking monthly donations. So commitments from large companies to give them monthly amounts, and that's simply because cash flow is king. They need to have consistent cash flow because what they're dealing with is not being able to pay their employees and whatever other fees that they have to pay for maintaining the tool set. And so if they were to continue with the donation-only model, which I don't think is sustainable anyway, then they should really be seeking monthly contribution and not just one-time contributions, because that would be more in line with their expense structure.
So, Justin, what kind of business model do you think Babel should utilize to free themselves of this predicament that they're currently in?
I think the business model that would make the most sense for what their product is, which is a tool chain or a tool model, a developer model, a developer product, sorry, I shouldn't say that, developer service, developer product, is to have a licensing structure where it's free for anyone or any company that makes, just hypothetically, makes less than, say, $10 million in annual revenue. And then if you make more than $10 million for annual revenue, or maybe a different number, just hypothetical, then you would ask that they contact your sales team and then set up a actual license, and so that they would actually pay you. So I think for Babel, it would make the most sense to try to leverage their enterprise revenue space or market space, and then try to get the large payers to pay them. If their target is only $333,000 per year, they could certainly get that just from the enterprise level. When we look at other levels of revenue for open source models, typically we're looking at the per user basis. So GitHub, you can see they leverage a significant amount of money from their per user basis. And so every user will have a pro account, they pay a monthly subscription fee. So that's kind of a per user market. And then there's the team market. So teams of developers may pay a subscription fee for whatever services that are sold at that particular level, bundled at that particular level. And then there's the enterprise. So for large organizations, they have private repos and they have all those functions and support mechanisms that are given to them by having an enterprise level license. And so when I'm thinking what Babel should do is they should continue with their donation model because that is one source of revenue, but they should leverage a licensing structure for enterprise clients.
So do you think it's a possibility that maybe in the short term or even in the longer term that a larger company most likely might acquire Babel because of the current trajectory that it's going on?
Personally, I think that's a big possibility, and I think that's actually likely, but I don't have much data to back that up, so maybe I'm just assuming. Yeah, it is hypothetical.
And so the reason why I don't believe that Babel is going anywhere, and firmly believe that Babel isn't going anywhere, is simply because open source is again really flourishing and really dominating the development market. Really on the productivity and tool side for developers, which I think is an important distinction. Open source as a business model may not work for everything. And I think a good example is kind of like it doesn't really work for a product that's used by your end users. And maybe I'm completely wrong about this, but we see a lot of open source being very effective when it comes to productivity and developer functions, Docker, Kubernetes, GitHub. But we don't really see it so much in terms of like open source, a successful open source social media platform. We see a lot of proprietary code when it comes to social media platforms. And it comes down to like what your product is. Like Babel is a product for developers, really. Or like for your ops team. It's really about ensuring availability for all of your users. Your end users don't know anything about Babel. They don't need to know anything about Babel. It is a development and operations tool. And that's where open source really flourishes.
So yeah, I kind of agree, Justin, because when we look at like businesses that provide tools to developers, let's say Microsoft, we're seeing this huge ecosystem move away from proprietary software towards an open source environment. If we remember Microsoft maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was this huge proprietary source code with Windows being a part of it, with .NET Framework being a big part of it. And now, if you look at Microsoft, you actually see a big change. And I kind of want to praise Microsoft for something like that because we see things like GitHub acquisition from Microsoft in 2015, if I'm correct. We see things like Microsoft joining the Linux Foundation in 2016, which is a huge, huge sign for us because Microsoft developers are actually contributing to Linux, and Microsoft's probably paying those developers to contribute to open source software without any kind of direct return on investment on those contributions. Although I believe Microsoft's doing that to enhance their Azure functions and Azure tools that use Linux. But we're kind of seeing all these stuff. We're seeing actually .NET become open source, and we're seeing Visual Studio Code become a huge thing in the industry where everybody's using Visual Studio Code. And all of these are maintained by Microsoft, and all of these are paid by Microsoft. So we can actually see big companies like Microsoft, even though all the other companies are doing it too, are moving towards open source, and they're recognizing this huge opportunity for them and for the development community to help each other and also to grow together, helping each other to actually add value to everyone by contributing to these open source packages. So, as you said, Justin, I don't think Babel's going to go out of business, but us as developers should at least make a note of things like this. And maybe that's a note to me and people like me that we should contribute more to open source. And
All right. Thank you, Parsa. And thank you, Justin. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to this week's podcast. We'll see you next week.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. See you next week.
see ya.